from your position. Okay, welcome to session 8. Session 8 is on patriarchy, social norms, and gender inequality. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Marcella for the presentation on measuring patriarchy in Italy.
So, thank you so much. It's my duty to wake you up. First of all, for those of you who know me, you know that I never wear makeup. So this lipstick is for you. It's the only thing I can actually do in person for doing that. Anyway, so let's think about that. Also talking about patriarchy, which is a big issue here at Levy. So we are really happy because I'm here with Giulia, Zacchia, one of my co-authors. Erika Aloè was here with me in 2022. So, and as you can see, we are representing a group of researchers. You see that lady with the colorful hair is Minerva, is a goddess of science, a tough woman, anyway, and is representing the Laboratory on Diversity and Gender Inequality that I coordinate since 2017 in Sapienza, University of Rome. Some of you were with us a few weeks ago, let's say so you maybe recognize the place. And for those of you who were not with us at the fantastic IAF conference that IPAC and I organized in Rome, you're always welcome, of course. So, I'm pretty sure I don't need to convince you that Italy is a patriarchal town, is a patriarchal city, sorry, it's a patriarchal country, and Rome is a patriarchal city. It's just enough to think about the Pope and Vatican, and everything is already defined. Anyway, let's try to be more precise. And let's start with talking about, well, in those 2 days, we spoke several times about social norms in different ways, in different contexts, and so on. But let's start talking about stereotypes, just to give you a quick idea of what it means to be patriarchal in a country like Italy. So these data that I'm showing you are coming from a survey by our National Statistical Institute, ISTAT. They are not from the 50s, they are from 2018. And as you can see, they show quite clearly what it means patriarchy in our country. Just to give you several examples, of course, but I concentrated my attention, and so I drive your attention to that, to those numbers that I also highlighted in with the circle. Men are less fit to take care of household chores, so of housework. Not only there is a large number of Italian citizens who believe that this is true, so they agree or very much agree with this sentence. But as you can see from the numbers, we're actually talking about different countries in one country. Because as you can see, there are differences from the north, the center, and the south of Italy. So in that sense, we talked already in other papers about Italian dualism in a gender perspective, in a feminist perspective, and that's our starting point also here. So we are a patriarchal country. We are more than one patriarchal country in the same territory. So for the first time ever, we decided to calculate, to measure patriarchy in our country, starting from a regional perspective. And of course, we had some very important references in doing this. Well, first of all, the paper by Gruber and we never heard how to pronounce it, anyway, Disek, I think, that developed a patriarchy index in terms of a comparative study of power relations across historical Europe. Then a paper by Sinha and others concerning India Patriarchy Index. And last but not least, of course, what I heard with my ears in 2022 here, and then shared, of course, in terms also of email exchange between me and Ajit while we were talking about this issue in Italy and try to develop our indicator. But as you can see, and as you probably already know, Thomas, Fernando, Luisa, and so on were all involved in this study. So thanks, of course, for the inputs that you gave us. So here we are. Sources of data. Because the first issue, of course, as always, is to find the right data to perform this task. So we put together quite a lot of databases that, of course, do not speak each other, as usual. So there was a lot of work for us to make them speak directly. The most recent Italian cross-sectional element referring to 2019 of the so-called EU Silk, that is, of course, a very important data set for those of us who work on gender issues, feminist economics issues in Europe. The last available wave of the Italian Time Use Survey, as you can see, we are talking about 2013, 2014. No need to go back to what we said, of course, in previous sessions. The data collected for the Italian well-being indicators report, that is something actually very important for us, and refer to 2021. Then the World Value Survey, 2017, 2022, and something that probably you never heard about, but it's been very important, the Jacobi survey conducted by the Bank of Italy for that part of our analysis that refers to financial education. And of course, the gender gap in financial education and financial literacy. Jacobi is actually the contribution that the Bank of Italy gives to the OECD for their literacy review. So, what we've done with all this information. So, we based also, of course, referring to the 3 papers that I mentioned before, to 4 different domains that, of course, you will see spelled out in terms also of indicators, and especially in terms of patriarchal hypotheses. The first domain concerns the domination of men over women. The second one concerns the domination of older over younger generation. This is extremely important in Italy. The third one is what is usually called patrilocality. And the fourth one, on which we work quite a lot, improving or in any way changing some contribution already given in the literature, concerns the socio-economic domination. 4 domains. These 4 domains, I must specify immediately, have a strong link also with the domains that the European Institute of Gender Equality refers to in calculating, in measuring gender equality in the European Union, thanks to the Gender Equality Index that they produce. But I will come back to that also later. So, obviously, I must be very quick because of the lack of time, so please have a look while I speak, and in any case, the paper is available, and especially has been just published on the Review of Political Economy, so it's very easy to have a look at it. So for the domination of men over women, we have several indicators and several patriarchal hypotheses that we have to specify, which means that all these indicators are related to patriarchy either with a negative or a positive sign. Certainly is negative the sign that links the proportion of female household heads to patriarchy, the proportion of non-married couples, the proportion of women older than their male partner, the proportion of single women never married living in a mononuclear household, and the proportion of women single parents everything means emancipation in a way or in another, of course, is against patriarchy, roughly speaking. While it's linked in a positive way, in a sense that it's perpetuating somehow patriarchy, the proportion of unpaid care and domestic work performed by women, we talk about that all the time, so obviously there's no need to add anything about this. And the proportion of not married men in the age 35, 69 years old that live with their parents. That is, by the way, something very common in Italy. So when men do not get married, they stay with their parents, or better, they stay with their mommy. So at least they have everything clean, everybody takes care of them in cooking and so on. So you've probably seen this in many movies about Italian men and so on. Obviously, they are not like that. But still, it's quite an important indicator to take into account. The domination of older over younger generation, I told you that this is very important for us. We worked on the generational aspect of gender inequality also in other papers. One for all is the one that we dedicated to the analysis of the impact of the pandemic in terms of elderly mortality, published on the special issue of Feminist Economics. Once again, the same three authors. So the we is not a general we, but it's the same three people. Once again, patriarchal hypothesis. What somehow perpetuates patriarchy in our country is the proportion of never married women, 51, 61, 69 years old, that live with their elderly parents. This is something that in Italy we call usually zitelle. So people that obviously are dedicated for all the rest of their life on taking care of their parents. Vice versa, the one that try to emancipate the proportion of young 17, 34 years old, single, never married men living in a mononuclear household are somehow something new that must be monitored. Patriarchality, it means time spent by elderly fathers with their older children. So somehow a perpetuation of the domain of the older generation in terms of men over their male children. Finally, the socio-economic domination, which I told you we work quite a lot on, negative and positive. In terms of negative, is the proportion of women 25, 64 years old that are in the labor market, emancipation through labor. Proportion of women more educated than their male partners. More education means, of course, more freedom of choice. This is the implicit assumption. Proportion of women elected at local level, power is power. And proportion of women that subscribe or own a bank account, Yakofi, as you can see. Financial education. Vice versa, gender gap in involuntary part-time that is growing enormously in our country and is more and more a female indicator. Proportion of mothers of children with less than 18 years old that are in occupation that allow reconciliation. Proportion of population that believe abortion is never justifiable, and this is something that we actually taken directly from the Levy examples. And proportion of, despite the fact that we first tried with actually quantitative indicators of abortion, and proportion of population that believe women who do not want sexual intercourse manage to avoid it. And so if they are subject to gender-based violence, also it's their fault, it's clear. So having said that, how did we calculate the patriarchy index? We take patriarchy points, as a starting point, one for each domain. For each domain, we have this round proportion that in any case cannot be more than 10 in terms of value, which means that summing the four sub-indexes that are at most 10 each, we have an indicator that runs between 0 and 40 patriarchy points. the higher the indicator, and of course, the higher is the prevalence of patriarchy in the area that we analyze. So, having said that, what is the result? Well, as you can see, we have managed to analyze the different parts of Italy according to the Patriarchy Index. And I suppose for those of you who know Italy, it's not surprising to see that we have two different countries, in a sense that the south of Italy and the islands have a much higher level of patriarchy than the central part of Italy and the northern part of Italy. Having said that, you might say, so what is new in all this? Well, the new is that we have an indicators that allows you to measure all this. And so what we hope, because this is just a starting point for us, of course. So what we hope is that we can be a good example to follow. This good example could be taken, for example, by the European Institute of Gender Equality. So I invite all the Europeans that are here to come together and try to convince because all these data are available, of course, for the European Institute of Gender Equality quite clearly. So they could actually establish a procedure to calculate this index, or something even more sophisticated than this index, of course, but along the same lines, to put together the patriarchy index and the gender equality index. Why? Because we pretend that in this way, we are measuring the invisible part of gender inequality. So I would say this is a very important task for an agency that is paid with public money, that has as its own aim to facilitate the progress towards gender equality in the European Union, having said that the European Union has gender equality as its aim since the Treaty of Rome in 1956. Thank you so much. That's the end. The full paper is available, and thank you from all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcella. Wonderful.
Did I wake you up?
Thank you. I now invite Haroon Akram-Lodhi as a discussant.
Yeah.
Right. Well, so first of all, of course, I enjoyed reading the paper. It's a very easy read. I like things that are easy to read, and I think it's an interesting contribution to the creation of gender-based indices. If I start with just an overview, the paper starts out by saying that patriarchy is abstract. And so what the paper wants to do, doesn't use the word pragmatically, but I will, pragmatically wants to describe patriarchy from an economic perspective as a complex aggregate represented by a series of variables related to behavior. So the audience for this, I think, obviously scholars and students, but I also think it's targeted at policymakers and civil society organizations, because it wants to be used, and it wants to inform debate. So the paper then runs through some of the information which Marcella put up in the second slide. That the data that is available demonstrates that gender discrimination and stereotypes with accompanying gender discrimination remain prevalent in Italy, especially in two specific areas, the labor market, as well as the personal family sphere, especially as it relates to the care for dependent children. But the data also is subject to a strong territorial heterogeneity, as demonstrated in the data with this division between North, Central, and South. So as Marcella said, there are 4 domains contained within the index. The degree of patriarchality has 1 indicator attached to it. The dominance of men over women has 7 indicators attached to it. The dominance of older over younger generations has 2 indicators attached to it. and socioeconomic domination has 8 indicators attached to it. And for each indicator, as we were told, these patriarchy points are calculated to a maximum of 40, more points, more patriarchy, and they are summed. With the means of the indicators of the 4 domains then being summed in turn. That's not the right slide.
No.
So there were the results, because this did not contain a Catagua.
Yeah, please.
It's following me around like a nightmare. So we have the results, and the results that Marcella put up and strongly show the South, which historically was always considered the periphery of Italy since unification, that the patriarchy index is much stronger in the South. So comments. Well, first of all, the paper's already been published. So because it's already been published, there's really not much that I can say about it because they can't change it. They can only move forward with it. But having said that, I would make some comments about indices. Because it's an index, and I think it is worth thinking about indices, particularly when we're thinking about feminist economics and gender and the economy. So the starting point for really this mushrooming of indices was the creation by Al-Haq and Sen in 1990 of the Human Development Index, because it's really since then that there's been a proliferation of indices. And part of that proliferation is the ongoing dissatisfaction that is present with income measures as an indicator of the quality of life, and the recognition that there's a need to capture a much broader array of social and political indicators of the quality of life, that income just doesn't cut it. And it really is interesting, the emphasis on income, because I mean, I used to tell, I don't do that anymore, but I used to tell my first year student, I gave him a quote from Simon Kuznets, who in the 1930s was basically the inventor of GDP. And it's a quote which basically says, you know, GDP is not a measure of welfare. You know, it's just a very specific measure, right? But it's not a measure of human welfare. And yet, that sort of position has become completely forgotten in the use of indicators like GDP. So there's been a huge growth in these gender-based indices since the creation of the HDI, which was not specifically gender-based index. The Gender Development Index and the Gender Empowerment Measure, which were created by UNDP a few years later. The Global Gender Gap Index, which produces the voluminous report every year. The UNDP's now Gender Inequality Index. We also have the Women's Empowerment and Agriculture Index, the Gender Parity Index, the Gender Equality Index, the plain old Gender Index, and now we have the Patriarchy Index. And all of these things differ simply on the basis of the variables that are included at the behest of the creators of the index. Now, all of these indices suffer from the same issue, and that is that the weighting of the variables is completely arbitrary. There is no basis by which you can scientifically say that these should be the weights that are adopted. So in the Patriarchy Index, the weighting of a domain with 1 or 2 indicators is the same as the weighting of a domain with 7 or 8 indicators, which then says that some indicators are more important than others. Or does it? Yeah, because there is a weight, there's an implicit weighting going on here. So this means that the utility of an index doesn't come from a single set of observations. Rather, it comes from observations over time. Because by seeing how an index changes over time, this is what allows the index to have meaning to its intended audience, and thus value added for those who use the index. And you especially can see this with the HDI, which almost didn't survive its first 4 years. But now, I mean, I can remember even as early as Oh, gosh, that was that early? 1993, when I was living in Fiji and the HDI came out and it was front page news in the newspaper. So it was really quite important in terms of speaking about rhetoric around development and inequality. So seeing how these things change, that's the key thing, I think, over time. The other utility for an index is for comparative purposes. And in the paper, what we've got is a comparison of Italian regions. My suggestion then is, why not disaggregate other countries by regions and then look at the index comparatively? Because if it is the case that the periphery of Italy has this higher index, what about the periphery of Spain or the periphery of Greece? And so I would suggest that what you need to do is think about getting some money for a project in which you would expand this in terms of doing a broader coverage beyond Italy, number one. And the second thing would be doing it over time, because that's the thing which would allow you to say, well, even though there's problems in weighting, we can track the same variables over time. And in that sense, Marcella, when you say it, the Patriarchy Index is comprehensive, workable, quantitative, and comparative, that's right if you do it over time. One last personal view, however, which has got nothing to do with the paper. The weakness that feminist economists have said for decades around GDP suggests that any constructed numbers should be, such as indices, should be treated very carefully. And my question is, why do we dismiss ordinal measures? You know, prior to the creation of the HDI, UNICEF used as its method to evaluate countries' performance the under-5 infant mortality rate. Now, the under-5 infant mortality rate produced a ranking that was very different to GDP, was comparable across countries, had available data, was a meaningful measure, and it was strongly correlated with other ordinal measures of economic performance. And it generated quite, I mean, this is from the 1987 State of the World's Children report. They started using the under-5, this is where the age comes in, I remember these things. They started using the under-5 infant mortality rate in 1986. This is when James, oh, what's his name? Starts with a G, when he was the head of UNICEF. And you'll see it's a country ranking which is quite interesting because, for example, Cuba is much higher up on the list than it would be in other places because of its very low level of under-5 infant mortality. And you can see that in 1987, for example, Papua New Guinea was grouped very closely to Brazil, and Mexico was not all that far away. And there was one refinement that I did suggest at the time they should think about using in terms of thinking about performance, which was not the under-5 infant mortality rate itself, but the rate of reduction of the under-5 infant mortality rate, because that would be a very interesting indicator of comparative performance. You know, I do think indices have a useful purpose, but I think what we see is that we should never consider them a scientific measure. Yeah, what we should do is they allow us to powerfully communicate an idea to an audience that doesn't really understand that there's no scientific basis for the index.
I now invite the next presenter, Vijayamba. She's presenting mobility, norms, and women's employment during COVID-19 pandemic, evidence from India. Welcome.
Hi everyone, good evening. I know it's difficult to follow after Haroon. So at the outset, I would like to thank Levy Institute for giving me this opportunity to present this paper. And also it's my first time in New York and I must say I'm having a great time. Uh,
It's the company.
Okay, so I'm here to present my paper on mobility norms and women's employment during the COVID-19 pandemic, for which I draw evidence from India. So this is a collaborative work with Amit Basole and Shravan MK. So I have structured the presentation like this. I briefly talk about the motivation and then bring in the literature, specify what is my objective and the data method, and then show the results and conclude. Okay, so many of us know here that gender norms are an important determinant to understand women's employment. So we have norms with respect to mobility, which is how easy or difficult it is for women to go out and work. Norms could be with care work or male breadwinner norm, so which transcends into what is the income effect that is largely spoken. So when households' income increases, women withdraw from the work, and when it reduces, they enter the labor market. So all of this determine women's employment. Now, COVID pandemic was one such situation which brought in a severe shock to the households in terms of reducing the incomes. And there was also a reduction in labor demand. So as a result, men and women had to enter self-employment and particularly agriculture in the context of India. Now, because of the crowding in these sectors, so women who were previously not in the labor force actually stepped in, which resulted in more competition, and thereby it reduced the per person earnings. And in the situation of COVID, what happened is that what happens is that it is not easy to separate out norms versus the income effect. But in the case of COVID, we know that this shock was such that it reduced the household incomes. So what we are interested to understand is the increase in self-employment by women, is it mediated by social norms or not? So this is one such situation where we try to separate out the effect of norms, given that there is a reduction in household incomes, which we look at it as the income effect. So we are trying to study this question in the paper. Now coming to the review of literature, we start broadly with norms and women's employment, and then we go into the COVID and women's employment. So as I said, in the context of India, what happened between 2004-5 and say 17-18, there was a decline in women's participation. And after 17-19, there has been a rise. And particularly taking the pandemic period, so this huge increase in self-employment is described as a distress phenomena in the literature. Now, there are a set of factors that say determine women's employment. Income effect, as I already mentioned, is one such. And when the income of the household increases, the norms about women's entry into the labor market become more rigid. And there are other norms with respect to household work, marriage, motherhood, mobility, and also decision making, which collectively influence their ability to enter the labor market. Now, along with this, there are some concerns around, say, sexual violence and protection of family honor in this regard, which also is an important factor. Keeping aside the community or the family factor, larger concerns around violence by women themselves also is an important factor. So National Family Health Survey in the Indian context is one such data base which has tried to collect information on all these fronts. And a lot of studies have used this data to look into various set of norms corresponding to marriage, cohabitation, decision making, asset ownership, and so on. So the last paper, I think Marcella also had referred it. It is Abhishek Singh and others, which have constructed patriarchy index in the context of India. So there are a lot of studies with respect to norms, but limited set of studies look into the relationship between norms and employment. So we try to come here in this front and pitch the literature gap. Now, the next theme is about COVID and women's work. So we know that COVID was such a shock that the supply of labor as well as the demand was severely impacted. So there was a huge reduction in demand. As a result, supply also was impacted. So this had a differential impact on men and women. So different assessment surveys throughout the world show that women are more severely impacted than men. And talking about the sectors, so sectors that employ a huge share of women, particularly manufacturing, accommodation, food services, etc., are more impacted again. And coming to the Indian labor market, we have also seen a gendered impact in terms of loss in employment opportunity. So there was a contraction, as well as women who lost out jobs. It was more difficult for them to enter the labor market again. So one study that I've cited here says that it was 7 times, women were 7 times more likely to lose jobs than men. And for the women who have lost jobs, it is 11 times harder than men to come back to the labor market. So on the larger front, so basically women's participation, so there was an increase after the COVID pandemic, and this did not rise because of increased growth or economic activity and growing labor demand. But women entered the labor market to ensure the households of the lost incomes. So with this, we try to look into the question, and our objective is that given the rise in self-employment, which is coming from the reduced household incomes from the COVID pandemic, we try to see if social norms is one factor that tries to mediate this phenomenon. So I talk about the data and method as the next section. So as I said, we are using the National Family Health Surveys, particularly the 5th round in 2019. And for some of the variables, we also use the 4th round in 2015-16. And we also use the periodic labor force surveys, which is annual labor force survey in the context of India, to show some descriptive statistics. So what we are essentially doing is we try to compare women in districts that were surveyed previous to the lockdown and to those who were surveyed after the pandemic. So 17 states were surveyed prior to the lockdown and 11 states were surveyed afterwards. So we try to compare them. And our main variable of interest is the mobility index at the district level, which we construct. And this is the lagged variable, meaning in the 4th round of 2015-16, we construct this. So the idea is that if districts had progressive norms surrounding mobility previously, then will it enable women to step in when they are called upon to do so in terms of self-employment? So this index is based on self-reporting of women, if they are able to visit places such as market, community, or friends, or even health center without asking the permission of others in the household. So typically taking the spouse's permission. So we use, NFHS has different reports, data collected from men, women, couple, and so on. So we use the data that is collected from women for the paper. So before I go into the analysis, so we ensured that we did the balance check. So what we mean here is that we want to ensure that the sample that was surveyed prior to the lockdown and after were indistinguishable in terms of other characteristics that are unlikely to be impacted by the pandemic. So we have used made household head, household size, age, education of the women, and so on. So what we find is, in the case of urban sample, the characteristics of the sample before and after the lockdown is largely indistinguishable. Whereas in the case of rural sample, we found that the characteristics changed, and we are yet to explore it further. So for this working paper, we largely focus on the results pertaining to the urban sample. So to construct the mobility index, we focus on the 3 questions that are asked in the data. If the woman is allowed to go to market alone, or if she can go with someone else or not at all. Similarly, to places outside village or community and health facility. So what we do is we adopt a binary coding where if the woman can go alone, she's given a score of 1. And if she's not, or with someone else, we code it 0. We take a simple average, collapse it at the district level, and then take the average at the district level for the index. So the index ranges from 0 to 1. The more closer it is to 1, the more progressive we consider it. And this index is a proxy to understand how easy or difficult it is for women to come to enter the labor market when it is called so in terms of say stepping in for self-employment. So the regression analysis framework looks like this. We have the, so this is a cross-section framework. The dependent variable is corresponding to the woman. It takes 1 if she undertook employment in the preceding 7 days of the survey. And the explanatory variables, some of them are at the district level. So the LM is the lagged mobility index at the district level for the previous round in 2015-16. Then we have the COVID dummy, which says if the district was surveyed prior or after the lockdown. And then we have the lagged employment rate of women at the district level. So the idea here is that in the district, if previously more women are employed, then women have a higher chances of entering the labor market post-lockdown. And then we control for individual level characteristics such as age, education, wealth, quintile of the household, caste, religion, and also husband's employment. So we control for different such characteristics. Our main interest is the interaction between COVID dummy and the district lagged mobility index. So I'll come to the results first, talking about the descriptive statistics using the PNFS data. So here we have tried to see the quarterly changes for different categories of employment, particularly salary, casual, and self-employment for women in rural and urban sector. So we take the October-December 2019 as the base, and then we see what are the changes in the different categories. So we see that there is a sharp increase in self-employment. So the change in self-employment seen for the last 3 quarters is much higher than the overall change in the workforce. And this is very predominant in the case of rural sector compared to what we see in the urban space. So it is high for urban sector as well, but I would say that the rural sector change is highly predominant. So now coming to the results of the regression model, I will focus on the urban sector because our characteristics are largely indistinguishable for urban women. Our main interest variable is the interaction between COVID dummy and lagged mobility index. So this is positive and significant. So the 2 columns that we see here, and the difference is for one, we have included the state fixed effects, and for other, we have not included. So we see that the variable is significant in the case where state fixed effects are not included. Our interpretation of this is that the variation in norms and employment across states is larger than what we see within states. So that's why when we include the state fixed effects, the result disappears. And then lagged current work of women at the district is positive and significant. So if women are previously more employed in the district, then the women in that district have a higher chances of entering the work when the situation calls for. Husband employed is positive and significant. So this is contrary to the income effect. So how we are interpreting this is that though the husband is in employment, probably the reduced incomes after the pandemic from the COVID, it gives the necessity for women to enter the labor market. So that is why this is positive and significant. Then the demographic and socioeconomic characteristics are as expected. For example, Muslim women had a lower probability of employment compared to the other religious groups. And then upper caste women again had a lower probability of employment compared to the less privileged caste groups and so on. So yeah, I think to conclude, basically we find that districts with more progressive norms witnessed larger increases in women's employment post the pandemic. And the balance checks, told us that the characteristics are largely similar in the case of urban samples, so our results pertain more to the urban sector. And when we include the state fixed effects, the interaction term doesn't hold good and it is not significant. So therefore, we find that norms are indeed a very significant factor in determining women's employment, here at least in the case of the urban sample. So yeah, I conclude with this. Thank you.
Okay. The discussant for this paper, Vedavati, please.
Thank you for the invitation to the Institute. It's a real privilege to be here with this group today. And Vijayamba, I think this is a really important paper in the Indian context. So I'm going to start with a short summary, and then I'll have some suggestions which will hopefully you'll find useful to improve the paper. So the key takeaway for me was mobility matters for women's. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
If I move away?
No.
So, mobility matters for women's employment in India. And I thought it was a really clever identification strategy to use this staggered data collection of the NFHS. So as you mentioned, NFHS data collection was sort of split by the COVID-19 pandemic. So some districts were surveyed before the lockdown, some districts were surveyed after the lockdown. And so you use this staggered data collection to compare employment among women in districts with less restrictive and more restrictive norms about women's mobility. And you find that women in urban districts with less restrictions on mobility are more likely to be employed compared to their counterparts where there are more restrictions on mobility. Okay, so my first comment is about the construct of mobility norms. As you laid out, 3 questions if women are allowed to go to the market, to the health facility and outside their community. To me, these are actually much better measures of women's agency. And I think that there's an important distinction between women's agency and norms. The norms can be descriptive, so what you think other people do or what your perception of other people's behavior is. Or the norms could be injunctive, what you think your own behavior should be. And to me, these questions are actually they better capture the construct of women's agency, which I think is also very important and just distinct from norms. So that is my first point. And so this is just a suggestion for the framing of your paper, whether you want to focus on this as norms mediating the effect of COVID, or whether you want to think about this, as more as women's empowerment agency along those lines. So my second question is about the mobility index, and Haroon had some points about that. And about the weights, right? So you assume equal weights for the 3 components. And as you just mentioned, weighting is kind of arbitrary. So my suggestion about that would be to actually think about how important each of these components are for your outcome of employment. I mean, is going to the health facility as important as going to the market or outside your village? And then take your decisions accordingly and maybe try some weights and robustness checks. And then the second point about the mobility index is the categorical nature of mobility. And I think actually retaining that categorical nature is quite important, because being allowed to go with someone else is quite different from not being allowed to go, not being allowed at all. I mean, it could mean the difference between your husband dropping you to work versus not being allowed to step out of the house at all. And so I think just retaining that anyway, if you're scoring it between 0 to 1, it shouldn't matter. So I would just recommend retaining that. Okay, then coming to the contribution, I think you laid it out really nicely in your presentation, the focus on women's mobility, right? Like we want to look at these intra-household factors because the gender gap in labor force participation is obviously very persistent, and there are all these policies and programs which provide women with access to resources, but they aren't really looking at these intra-household factors. And then second, the fact that mobility mediates this the effect of COVID. So I think you laid it out really well in your presentation. I think the paper would benefit from just highlighting that contribution more and situating what gaps your research fills in the literature. Okay, so this was interesting, right? Like your results sort of change with the addition of state and fixed effects. And I think this is where the norms might actually be coming into play. So you have both descriptive and injunctive norms that likely differ by state and then also correlate with mobility. So this could be norms related to women's work, entrepreneurship, education, and then also supply side factors like the availability of jobs, loss of jobs. And so my suggestion here is, what if you try restricting your study sample to just the districts in the states and union territories that were surveyed both pre and post-COVID lockdown. So you basically, if you remove the states that were surveyed pre-COVID only, so that might reduce your sample size, but it could also mitigate the state-specific effect that you're finding. So that's just one suggestion. Okay, coming to your variable definitions. So throughout the paper, you document really well that there's a rise in women's self-employment and that this was likely distress-led. But as I understood it, the outcome tested was actually whether a woman engaged in paid work. So I would just very directly test the effect on self-employment. I believe you can combine variables from the NFHs to actually do that. Because your PLFS descriptives show that increase in self-employment, drop in salaried work. And so this would go to testing to what extent the positive effect on employment in urban areas is driven by switching from salaried work to self-employment. And last couple of points. One is, I think, looking at the relationship between mobility and women's employment outside of the COVID context is really important. Because here you see, COVID induced that distress, self-employment due to distress, but just looking more without the COVID context, what did this relationship look like? And I suggest a way you could do that. So you could compare your beta 1 from your current regression, which was the coefficient for mobility pre-COVID, and you could do a more descriptive regression of women's employment in NFHS 4 using the lag mobility from NFHS 3. Just to get an idea of what this relationship looks like in absence of this shock. Turning to the policy implications, I was a little unclear. I would suggest somewhat of a caution because if the effect in this, if the effect on self-employment due to COVID was likely a distress phenomenon, I was sort of trying to wrap my head around what this means. If we think of interventions and programs that encourage women's freedom of movement, what does this mean for their work? And I think unpacking the type of work a little more would help. So what is the type of self-employment? What happened to women's wages, etc. So yeah, with that, I will end. Thank you.
The third paper is by Sarah Small and co-authors, When Men Fix the House, a Marxist feminist approach to gendered housework and exchange value.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Start my timer here. Great. So this is me, and it's the last presentation of the day. There's actually a lot of pictures in this, which I hope you like. Our dean makes us do, have you heard of pecha kuchas? They're like presentations that are just rapidly moving pictures, and you really have to depend on your own brain for it. So I'm trying to adopt more of that in my own work. This is my wonderful co-author, Bhavya, who I really want to highlight here. She's joining us on Zoom, so I'll wave to her. But she's on the market this year, so please keep her in mind if you're hiring in any of your institutions. She's a really wonderful kind of heterodox macroeconomist, training under Rama Vasudevan, who I know many of us here work closely with. So our main kind of question here is like what is masculine type housework and why is it categorized as such? And we're thinking about this very much in the context of the United States. where maybe many of you are familiar, but right, it's kind of a very like masculine type thing to do, to fix the house or mow the lawn or fix the car, right? And we also see this show up in American time use data. So this is not just my own stereotypes, right? This is evident in the data. And basically, Bhavya and I find a lot of the explanations that rest on like, men are just doing gender, right? They're just performing manhood. We find those a little unconvincing. So we want to think about, can we answer this question in terms of, right, using our background in political economy and social reproduction theory. And this was really born out of a dissatisfaction I've been writing about for a few years now with this thing called gender deviance neutralization theory. This paper I'm citing here is a famous kind of QJE paper, right, like one of the top journals in economics, where they show that when women earn more than men, they actually, in the United States, they actually end up doing more housework than those who earn the same or less, right? And their kind of theory behind this is, oh, well, they're trying to kind of accommodate for like the fact that women are now the breadwinners, and they don't want to like disrupt the gender norms, right? And there's similar literature that suggests similar dynamics for men, right? So for instance, when men in the US work in more feminized industries for their paid work, they often do less housework and avoid kind of feminized, right, housework in the home. Right, I have a few other papers up here, right? Men assign more positive adjectives to masculine typed housework. Again, in the US, this means things like mowing the lawn, fixing the house, etc. And some other kind of qualitative work has shown that sometimes if men feel like they have to pay someone to come fix the house or fix the car, it can imply a failure in like this duty of care in a masculine sense. So basically, Bhavya and I are reading all this literature and saying, okay, well, first of all, why, right? Why is this type of work the work that men are doing? And second of all, like we just are not convinced that it's a function of taste and preferences. And I think most feminist economists would think similar things. And so what we're kind of thinking about here is masculine typed housework partially done in service to capital, right, rather than social reproduction? And I'll kind of define some of these terms in a little bit. And the reason we're thinking about this is also kind of in tandem with some work I've been doing on housing, particularly in the US, right? Housing is really thought of not just in terms of its use value, but it's also the way in which Americans store a great deal of their wealth, right? The average American really has almost all of their wealth in owning the home, which Haroon and I actually were talking about this morning. So, right, we're kind of thinking about, okay, these types of activities men are doing are actually really building equity, right, in their home, right? Kind of improving the asset of the home, building this exchange value part of the home rather than necessarily the use value, but we can talk about that distinction. So we're really kind of trying to challenge these doing genders theories of housework in this way. Put more simply, right, it's kind of different to just do dishes for like your family to eat a meal the next day versus to fix a house, right? And there's lots of literature about how fixing the house it doesn't happen as often, it takes less time. But we're also thinking about, okay, well, one of these things is in service to your family very directly, right? We need to feed people. The other is in service to the family. They need to have a house to live in that's of high quality, but also in service to capital, right? And kind of selling that house down the line. So just some kind of quick definitions here. And I know many of us are well acquainted with kind of social reproduction theory as Marxist feminists define it. I particularly kind of would think about this definition, right? Kind of thinking about women in particular, women's unpaid care work serving to reproduce labor power, both on an intergenerational and daily basis. And a lot of literature in social reproduction theory is really focused on work that women are doing, not so much as focused on this work that men are typically doing. So again, we're trying to kind of think about that. And when political economists and kind of Marxist feminists have thought about like, well, why are women doing this work, right? I point to, for instance, Heidi Hartman, who would kind of famously tell us that women's unpaid housework is exploitative and in service to men in the patriarchy. So if we are thinking about that as why women are doing the like feminine housework, we don't have a similar explanation for why men are doing the masculine housework, at least that I'm aware of. And there's really, I think, important kind of regional and of course wealth implications in this theory that we're kind of trying to think about here. There's literature that suggests that men in urban areas in the United States spend, of course, relatively little time on masculine type chores. And this makes sense, right? Like if you don't have a backyard, you don't need to mow the lawn, right? But they also find that men in urban environments like these spend the same amount of time on feminine type chores as their rural counterparts. So in other words, they're not kind of making up for this not having a lawn by doing more dishes, right? There's also, I think, some important literature looking at home ownership. And it's kind of obvious, right? If you're a renter, it's your landlord's responsibility to fix the house, right? So if there's some problem with your stove, they're supposed to come in and fix it. So it makes sense, right, that in home-owning households, there's a lot more of this type of work going on as opposed to renter households. And in fact, right, we find in the literature, right, that in home-owning households, housework burdens are relatively more even, measured in terms of time use, but this is largely driven by, right, men's time spent fixing the house. And again, kind of thinking about like a Marxist approach to housing, particularly in the US, right? We're thinking about questions of like both use and exchange value, right? Where like the use value of the house is that we need it for our shelter. And of course that's important and we need that in terms of our social reproduction, right? We can't go to work the next day if we don't have a house to kind of eat and sleep and bathe in. But it also, especially in the US, is becoming increasingly important in terms of exchange value. It's a huge part of, again, Americans' wealth holdings. Right, an exchange value of kind of defined up here for folks, right? It's kind of power to command certain quantities of other commodities in exchange. Right, and Marx really emphasizes, right, the movement of exchange value as a central to the mode of production of capitalism. Hence, right, we're kind of thinking about masculine type housework that contributes to the appreciation or exchange value of houses as something that is serving capital and serving capitalism. And so we started to think about like, okay, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. We started thinking about like, okay, do we want to just make this paper like a purely theoretic paper where we're just kind of bringing this point to people's attention and motivating it? Or do we want to also include some type of empirical analysis? And right now, I think it's a little bit of a half-baked in between both of those things. But one of our attempts to start thinking about maybe like an empirical support of this is to essentially kind of exploit different types of housing units in the United States and the value that they accrue. So for folks who don't know, mobile homes, which are a very common form of affordable housing in the United States, are typically not sold at the same value in which they're purchased, whereas other types of housing units, when you purchase them, they often go up in value quite substantially over time. So this makes the case of kind of like home maintenance investments in a mobile home pretty distinct from those of a home that you're going to be able to resell for much more value than you initially purchased it for. Right, so in other words, right, a lot of, mobile home owners are really undertaking this type of maintenance on their mobile homes for their own use value, right, not for exchange value. And if you're interested, there's, I think, not enough literature on mobile homes, particularly given how many people live there and their kind of role in our economics and society, but Esther Sullivan has this really great book up here that I recommend. So in any case, right, we look at some American time use data from 2008 to 2022, and just do a simple OLS regression where our dependent variables vary between housework overall. And then second, we also look at a dependent variable of masculine typed housework, which again is not just my own stereotypes, it's based on, right, the American time use data where men are spending more time on these activities than women. I list them below here, right? So it's pretty much just maintenance of the home, lawn and garden care, vehicle maintenance, and maintenance of appliances. And then in our kind of third model, we hone in specifically with a dependent variable on maintenance in particular. So that's just interior and exterior maintenance of one's home. Right, we have all these various controls, which I list up here that might inform how much time one's able to spend doing these things. But our main kind of variables of interest are first, right, this beta 1 and thinking about like the role of home ownership, which literature's already suggests, of course, increases men's time spent on these activities. And then beta 3, right, we really want to think about, is this different for mobile homeowners who have this very different experience of kind of, right, being able to sell their homes in the future. This is kind of a truncated version so everyone can see what we're looking at here. But basically, right, we're running all of these 3 models, right, with 3 different dependent variables, all just for the sample of men, right, in American time use. And basically what we find is kind of across all 3 dimensions of, right, total housework, masculine type housework, and home maintenance, that of course, one being a homeowner leads to, or is indicative of, I should say, more time spent in these types of activities. Additionally, however, right, if you live in a mobile home, men are spending, right, less. We kind of think about a few robustness checks, although I think we could do more, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that as well. One of which is thinking about this question of, you know, is being rural a really important component of this, which literature did indeed suggest that, you know, of course, folks in these rural communities are doing quite a bit more of this type of work. And we do see that's the case, but we don't really see anything particularly interesting necessarily in the case of folks who live in mobile homes in rural areas, right? So anyway, I'll come back to those findings because I have some questions for you all about where you think we should take this. But our point here is that, like, where Marxist feminists have argued that so much of like this feminine typed housework on social reproduction is for the sake of social reproduction and is also kind of exploitative in terms of patriarchy, right? We argue that this masculine typed housework contributes to the expansion of exchange value and ultimately serves capital. I don't want to talk down on the masculine typed housework also though in terms of like care and reproduction. Of course, like again, of course, we need homes to live in, and maintenance of homes is important an important component of social reproduction. I also think, right, like there's some interesting literature about this being a culturally celebrated form of care, right, for men, which I don't think we should kind of brush under the rug either. Julie Nelson has kind of a great piece in the Cambridge Journal about husbandry and kind of how can we encourage men to take on this ethic of husbandry in this sense that she describes as a masculine responsibility for care that doesn't revolve around breadwinning or like financialized masculinity is what she calls it. So my questions for you all, things I'd really like to hear feedback on in particular. Should we include this empirical stuff? Is it a little like too off the wall, right? There's kind of a lot of issues, particularly in that folks living in mobile homes have a variety of other things going on that we're controlling for, but we can't capture everything. Or should we just get rid of that and like bolster the empirical, or excuse me, the theoretical component? And I think there's ways to do that. I also think there's ways that we could ideally expand this kind of beyond a US context. And I don't know if that's going to be empirical or theoretical, but something we could think about. And then lastly, like, I think this, I'm excited about this connection we're making, but I think we could bolster it by thinking about like, what is it that makes men's relationships with capital so important, right? Is it just kind of like, and we can do a lot of hand waving, right, about like interlocking nature of capitalism and patriarchy, which is I think kind of where we're at right now, to be honest with you. But I think there's like deeper things we could look at here in terms of like property rights. I think we could think more deeply about like the role of race, and particularly the United States. So those are some things I'd be particularly keen to hear from you. But of course, all of your comments are welcome and appreciated. And thank you so much for having me. It's been such an honor.
Thank you, and Vijayamba for the comments for the paper and for discussion.
Thank you, Sarah, for that presentation. I must say I had a very enriching read looking into your paper. So I'll start with what the objective of the paper was. Basically, trying to position itself, trying to understand what masculine type work is about. So they try to challenge that it is not only about doing gender theories, but it looked at this type of work as a commitment to capital and what the Marxist explanation of patriarchy and capital has to give. So for me, as you have mentioned in the paper, the contribution is on these two fronts broadly. So they extend this explanation of doing gender theories and say that masculine type of housework is more to be seen as a commitment to capital. And they do it broadly by bringing the distinction between the masculine and feminine type of housework and how it is related to home ownership and expansion of value, which is largely seen. So these are the main contributions of the paper. So I have divided my comments or suggestions into two parts. First is the review of literature and the theoretical contribution that you talk about, and the next is the empirical support that you try to offer. After seeing your last slide, which was not in the paper, I think that the richness of the paper lies in the theoretical contribution, that you try to make. So you bring in varied perspectives from doing gender theories, then you offer Marxist explanations. Then there is the urbanist ownership perspectives that you bring in and the social reproduction theory as well. So I would like to say that this is very rich and well explained in the paper, and it would be really beneficial for the reader also to get a nuanced approach in this. So I have a few comments where other perspectives could be brought in. First thing is you say that when women earn more than men, they take up more household work, what you call as the gender deviance neutralization theory. So I was thinking, is this similar to the female guilt explanation? I have come across few papers which say that working women tend to engage more in unpaid work, and this could be traced back to the female guilt. So is this similar is one point that I was thinking. And then men doing home maintenance is not just about the doing gender explanation, but you say that it is more about their role in capitalist patriarchal hierarchy. So can we go back and talk about this in a social norms framework? So we know why women doing more of unpaid work is largely spoken in the context of social norms, but can we offer the same thing for men and talking about the housework that you are referring here? So the social norms have a role to play in this theoretical front. So these are my suggestions for review of literature and theoretical contribution. I have a few in empirical support. So first thing is you have used the American Time Use survey data, but you say that you have restricted the sample to men of 18 years and older. I understand that you are trying to explore the masculine type of housework, but what about the women? Like, did you, at least for the baseline regressions, when they tried, or maybe as a falsification test, if you can support it with what happened to women? I think the reader would be curious to know what the coefficients look like for women. And then the criteria of division of the three types of activities, housework and then traditional masculine and the interior and exterior maintenance, is somewhat a bit blurred for me. I think in all the three categories, there were some repetitions. One was maintenance of lawn and a couple of that I don't recall. So can we define it a bit more closely that it is really distinct from one another? And the criteria that you use is average time spent by men and women. But I was expecting, why don't you use a suitable theoretical framework? So if you're saying that you want to go back to, capitalist and patriarchal framework, can we bring that or any other theoretical framework that you feel is relevant to, again, divide the activities? So that is one. And then, overlapping activities I've already mentioned. So housework initially includes a lot of broad activities, and pure housework is something you bring in as a robustness check. So I was thinking that the pure housework would come in first, because that was more defined than what you used actually in the baseline regression. So if you can think about it, so that is one problem. The third point is on the type of housing that you bring in using the American Times survey. So initially you mentioned that you would use the differences in mobile home ownership as well as other types, but I did not come across other type. I know that you have mentioned it as a limitation, but initially when I read it, I was expecting that the other type of housing would somehow come in to distinguish itself from the mobile housing. So first point here is, why is mobile housing associated with a higher rate of housework for men? So this is somehow not explained more than what is given in the paper. So if you can interpret this, it would be easy to understand why the coefficient say so. Then yeah, the limitation is that it doesn't give data on different alternate types of housing. But can you look into other data sources, if there is any, about different types of housing, and if you can collate that data source into this if you are working on the empirical support aspect. The last point is on the result section, where you differentiate between the entire sample of men versus employed men. So a key result there is the interaction term, that is the owner and the type of housing, which is mobile housing, is negative as expected. But they are not statistically significant. So it was significant in the case of the sample of all men. So what is the interpretation of this result? So how are we exactly, trying to keep the two groups separate was not very clear to me. So yeah, I think these are some of the comments, and yeah, I would say that for me, the larger contribution is on the theoretical front, and if you decide to keep the empirical support, if a lot of these things with other points that you get, if it is incorporated, maybe it could enhance the, evidence for the paper. Yeah, thank you.
I invite the presenters move to the table. Collect questions from the audience.
In the middle.
Julia, please join me.
Thank you. I have some comments for Sarah. I thought this was a very interesting paper in terms of the mobile home question. Sometimes with mobile homes, you don't own the land beneath you. So I don't know if you could distinguish those that own land versus don't. But the other thing you have is a class difference going on there. That could be driving things, and they could be more patriarchal. So you might want to look at differences by income level. I expect the more affluent to hire out the yard work, the car maintenance, the house maintenance, the cleaning. But I also think you can look at alternative explanations. I mean, I find this very interesting. So just to cross out other explanations. I mean, one of them is that women are doing work that you can't control. It happens every day. You cook, you take care of the kids. You can't control your labor from your labor power. But the men can, right? You could fix the car, change the oil, you got a couple weeks to do that. Same with home repairs. So they can control their labor more. And is that what's going on? And then it's just pure patriarchy. I don't know what else to say. And then the other thing to look at is, I don't know if you could look at different housing values to see if that varies. But the other thing to look at that's always struck me is if you look at manufacturing, the men are in the durable or the heavy manufacturing. The women are in the non-durable or the light manufacturing. And that's pretty much across the world, which is striking. So, you could, so one of the, the men doing the car, doing the lawn, doing the house repairs, they have these tools. And the women, we have the brooms, we have the pots, right? But they even have the heavy, durable house tools compared to women. And I don't know what's going on with that, but it seems universal. So, but those are just other things to look at, but I think what you're doing is really exciting.
Thanks, Mom. Thanks.
Yes, please.
Hi, yes, well, I'd just like to carry on a little with that, and then I have some comments for Marcella as well. Yeah, I mean, I think you're just getting on at the end there to gender socialization. Now, I know you could see gender socialization, boys have the guns and girls have the dolls, you could see that as part of the reproduction of capitalist patriarchal relations, starting from an early age. But there are, within the sociological literature, a concept of emphasized femininity, for example. I think you said that there wasn't anything parallel really, but the whole concept of, feeding the family, emphasizing femininity through being the carer, through providing the food, through cooking the meals, and that is an essential part of the expression of femininity within a patriarchal context, always. Cars and boats. I lived on an English narrowboat for 12 years, and that's all about men, because it's engines, they're out doing the engines, polishing the metal, and these are things that depreciate in value, unlike home ownership. The cars and the boats will always, they'll halve in value within a year. So, yeah, I think we need to find a way of accommodating that, and the increase in father care as well. What's that about? Under your broad theoretical, there is evidence that aspect of domestic care is increasing in across many countries according to the Chinese diary data. So where does that fit? Because that's traditionally care is a feminine defined activity. Anyway, just things to think about. Marcella, I just wondered. I was thinking about patriarchy and the sort of current discussions around the threatened patriarchy and the MAGA movement here in the US, and what is it that's kind of defining that? And I was thinking about social capital and networking, and the sort of the old boys network, the old boys club, with some way of incorporating something of that, because that's the shared thing that's being threatened. And values, I suppose, come into that as well. And you started off with values, but I'm not sure that you incorporated those. What percentage of people, or men specifically perhaps, believe that a man's place is at work and a woman's place is in the home. Whether there's a place for that, possibly as some sort of proxy for the network, I'm not sure.
Mark?
It's real hands. I have this question about patriarchy.
When patriarchy has only social characteristics, it has important economic characteristics also. Can we include them also? For example, ownership of assets or access to credit, access to market. Some of these things could be included because they are purely because of patriarchy. I was just wondering whether we can include those features also. As regarding Vijayamba's paper, she is very correct that mobility is largely influenced by social factors, but economic factors are very important. Particularly during COVID, what happened in India was thousands of migrant workers shifted to rural areas with no opportunities in employment in urban areas, and that's why our structural transformation of employment that was taking place was reversed. So today we have more people in agriculture than in non-agriculture. The movement that was taking place is totally. So it became agriculture became a residual sector and self-employment increased because of that. That was a major reason. And similarly, opportunities of employment were very much limited elsewhere. You know, the employment crisis which started with COVID, we are still suffering from that because the recovery also has not generated those kind of employment opportunities, and it's capital intensive also. So we do not have employment opportunities generated in urban areas also. As a result of it, this reversal has happened, and that is really a problem in our employment situation.
Thank you.
Hi, first, I have a question for Sarah. I have a comment for Marcella. My question to Sarah is, first of all, I think it's fascinating to think about this issue in this framework. And given the empirical terms, like how men and women spend their time during the day, I think the time men in the US spend on yard work, car and house repair is a very, very small portion of all their housework activities. So they actually spend more time cooking, cleaning. So one thing I was thinking was, instead of using the absolute time spent, maybe using a ratio, and then thinking it further, maybe looking at the gender ratio of in terms of how they spend, and also how much of their housework or unpaid work time this is. So I think that maybe one more around this poll called ATUS, the time use survey data, which is a nightmare. The other thing I was thinking, this may help avoid some circularity in terms of, you know, people who own homes spend more time doing repair of homes. Does that make sense? So that's those are comments. To Marcella, I just did a comment. Especially when we are looking at countries where people tend to have ethnocentric worldviews towards, like Arab countries, Muslim countries. I think a patriarchy index to distinguish it from the effect of the religion is very, very important, attributing it to patriarchal norms rather than the dominant religion in that region. So I just want to say kudos. Thank you.
One last question.
Akram and maybe then Levy. Yeah, Akram can take this one.
So I have a question then for Sarah, and as Ebru just said, I think it's a very interesting idea, but I think you need to decide whether it's going to be more feminist or more Marxist.
Why?
The reason is because I'm not sure the Marxist moorings are particularly solid. You know, you did say at one point that you, with a reference to volume of capital, that exchange value is very central to the operation of capitalism, which it is. But you know, in the most fundamental way of understanding it, capitalism is a system of the exploitation of labor power to produce surplus value, which is realized as profit. And surplus value is not the same as exchange value. Now, the exploitation of labor power to produce surplus value takes place in markets. And of course, when a man fixes the car, I mean, there's no role for markets. It's the same problem we face when we think about reproductive labor. And what that means then is that in changing exchange values, there may be some productive labor, but there may also be unproductive labor. And, you know, Marx really wasn't very concerned with that. So I'm not quite sure that those moorings are adequate, and I think you need to think a bit more about that.
Thanks. One more question.
I'll be very quick. Also for you, Sarah, and sorry to follow up. But yeah, just again, very kind of provocative way of thinking about this. I guess, you know, people have already commented on some different ways to investigate this. The one thing I was thinking about is so much of our thinking of care and is often framed through a heterosexual lens, right? And if indeed the linkage is not about doing gender, then I think it would be very interesting to look at same gender relationships to investigate some of those roles and see how that fits into this overall kind of theoretical framework.
It's a good idea.
Gina, it's a short one, then you take yours otherwise.
Hi, I had a question for Vijayamba. So one comment, so as your commentator also mentioned about including the categorical variables for the constructing the index, you can do it. I mean, obviously, it may sound very obvious, but I just thought to pick it up. You can do it just by making it as a dummy and including in the way you are constructing the index. If it's some methods like principal component analysis or something, you can try to check the compatibility first to construct them. And the second thing was, as you have mentioned in your presentation, that the increase in women's employment can be related to the shock stressor. So one way you can try to identify the mechanism is by looking into the households based on their wealth or like the income levels. And the other way to take into account of the urban to rural reverse migration is to check into the rural urban households or the main occupations of the households, you know. So that can help you to identify the mechanisms behind it. Thanks.
So shall we give time for the presenters to respond? 2 minutes, maybe, starting from Marcella.
Okay. 1 minute each, but I want also to give the floor to Giulia. So, anyway, no. So, thank you so much for all the comments and suggestions. First of all, to Haroon, of course, for his discussion, very provocative. I must say in my 1 minute that I share this skepticism for the composite indicators, but unfortunately composite indicators are there and we have to face this challenge. So the challenge for us, of course, is to put politics in it. I mean, our index is feminist, the other one are not. And once again, I really would like to thank also the Levy Institute for giving an important input to our work. But now I leave the floor to Giulia.
No, thank you so much.
Just quickly, I completely agree that this indicator, the patriarchy indicator, should be something that should be compared in time and eventually, as we did it, looking at different regional spheres in one nation, or I mean, even in other countries. So absolutely, this is the point, and then we can show and see how this evolve, or I mean, if they are improved or not, and which are the differences in regions, and also to implement it to see how or to evaluate eventually some policies or some educational training that we have or everything that is implemented at the regional level. But I mean, the problem is that we use time use survey and still, I mean, we cannot run this exercise each year because, I mean, we don't have data to evolve and to see how it is eventually change. Or, I mean, if we have these time use surveys by year, it would be great and we could do that. And at the regional level, let me see, it's even, I mean, harder to find data. And so we have to consider and to see, I mean, to select these variables. Actually for the comment about the inclusion of ownership of financial assets, of women access to credit, we included in our social domain, social economic dominations main indicator, a domain that is related to the access to own bank account for women. So this it's the only proxy that we found given by our bank, national bank. So the Bank of Italy that has this information by regions in Italy that doesn't account for, I mean, the whole family, but just at the individual level. So referring to the single woman and so on. And the fact of religion, yes, it would be, I mean, interesting to see that. But I think that if we compare these in times and even looking at regions, these effect of religions, I mean, I think that we can see that also looking at the evolutions of the index and value survey and how we can include it. We have included in these indicators two different dimensions about value of social norms, most of all looking at abortion, and so which is the how is objective and which is the population evaluations of the freedom that women have to go for abortion. And this is important, I think, to keep it the whole population and not just male, because actually social norms are also embedded in women. So it's interesting to see how the total population is conceiving that, of course, at the regional level, and also about violence. So we have this also sexual violence against women, so the perceptions of the population about that. And these are the two variables that we included from the tables that Marcella showed us at the beginning.
Thank you, Vedavati, for those comments. I think it was very helpful. So I think the first thing was if we can differentiate agency and norms. So these questions on mobility are more talking about agency. But when we looked at data, in the NFHS had different questions with different norms. So particularly for decision making, there were questions on who decides these small household purchases, large purchases, and so on. So we thought that those questions were more representative of agency. And in one of our other works, we have also tried doing this. So we have used the decision-making index, ownership, and attitudes towards domestic violence. So all of these things and its relationship with employment. So particularly with decision-making, it was a positive and significant relationship. So the districts which had progressive norms with respect to decision-making positively influenced employment. And the next comment on weights, yeah, I think it is a very arbitrary and again a problematic thing when we work with indices, whether we have to give an equal weighted, kind of a measure, or if we have to use PCA or other kinds of doing the weighting. What we had done is we had tried a couple of methods. So we had also tried principal component analysis and the differential weighting that patriarchy index, referring to the other papers that Marcella also cited. But it becomes difficult to justify why we are, using these different weights. So given this problem, I think that we went ahead with going with the equal weighting measure, taking the simple average. And then keeping the different questions as it is, yeah, I think we can think about this. But what we had also done is we had two different definitions for the index. One is the stricter version and the other is a lenient version. So what we use in the paper is a strict version, where if only a woman can go alone is given a scoring of 1, otherwise 0. In the lenient version, going with someone or alone gets a 1 and the other gets 0. So we have tried this, but I think we can think about keeping the 3 questions separate. So that is a valid suggestion. And I also take the suggestion that if we can try this before the pandemic, so keeping the lagged mobility of the 3rd round. So we have not done that, we will do that. And with the different types of employment, the problem with NFHS is that it doesn't give a nuanced definition like the PLFS. So it is, I think we did some work, but we would like to relook into it. So that's why we brought in the PLFS data to substantiate it with the descriptive statistics. And then Professor Indira Hirve's comments that that this is during the COVID, there was a shift back to agriculture, how the economy was severely affected. Yeah, the literature also speaks a lot about this. And one comment to add here is that in the data, we also found that self-employment and agriculture for men had gone back to the pre-pandemic levels, but for women, it had not gone. So even in this, there is a very clear gendered impact that women were more affected than men.
Actually, as unpaid family workers, the number has gone up a lot in the recent times.
Yes.
Employment side.
Yeah, it has gone up for women. So it has not basically gone back to the pre-pandemic levels for women. So it has continued to remain high.
Yeah, it's still high.
Yeah, yes, yeah. And then Geelam's comments on PCA, I think I have clubbed that with my answer to the Discussants comment that we had tried it, but we went ahead with the simple average because it is difficult to justify. And then households wealth. So NFHS itself gives a variable called wealth index, which they use the PCA and they divide the household. So we have control for it. Apart from this, there is no other information. And also about the rural and urban households, there are no, I don't recall any separate questions that they ask about the reverse migration and these kind of questions. But we have tried the specification for both the sample rural as well as urban. So yeah, I think these are my comments. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. Well, I think I'll just, for the sake of getting us to the wine and dinner, say a broad thank you for the empirical suggestions, right, that our wonderful discussant gave, that Brew, Mary, right, lots of folks. And I would welcome, right, more comments and suggestions at dinner. It'd be really helpful. Just briefly, Marlene, this point about land and lot rent is a very important one. We have another paper coming where we're actually thinking about the bargaining power of mobile home park residents, right? Where it's impossible to move that house, so the landlord can jack up the rent on the land, and that's precisely what they're doing. So we stay tuned, I guess what I'm saying on that. And some of these other kind of theoretical points I really value, particularly, right, this point about the cars and kind of how do you think about maintenance on cars, and this framework is a good one. And Haroon, I need to think about your point a bit more. I think we did indeed delete Marx from the title for a variety of reasons. But I also, and this is just my own bias, feel like the social reproduction theory framework, at least the literature that I've read, is very deeply tied to feminist Marxists who I want to acknowledge, right? So I'll think about that more, but thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much for the question.